On the morning of April 1st, 1978, in a low ranch house in Rancho Mirage, California, a 59-year-old woman came downstairs in her dressing gown and found her entire family sitting in the living room, arranged like guests who had arrived without being invited. Her husband was there, which was unusual, because for 30 years her husband had almost never been there. Her 4 grown children were there. A doctor she had never met was there. It was 1 week before her 60th birthday, and the coffee on the sideboard was still warm, and Betty Ford understood, before anyone spoke, that this was not a birthday party. What happened in that room over the next hour should, by every actuarial measure of American marriage, have been the end. So the question this episode asks is a simple one, and a strange one. Betty and Gerald Ford's marriage absorbed a divorce scandal, a cancer, a national humiliation, an addiction, and an intervention, any one of which has dissolved 1,000 quieter marriages. Why did theirs hold? Stay with me. What they buried is stranger than what they told. Here is what this episode is going to show you. First, the wedding in October of 1948, where the groom arrived at the church late, with mud on his shoes, for a reason that tells you everything about the next 30 years. Second, the pinched nerve in 1964 that became a prescription, and the prescription that became a decade. Third, the single television interview, in August of 1975, that made Betty Ford the most argued, about wife in America, and what her husband did about it. Fourth, the night in November of 1976, when Gerald Ford lost the presidency and lost his voice on the same evening, and the woman who had to speak his concession for him. And fifth, the thing Gerald Ford did in that Rancho Mirage living room in April of 1978 that most husbands of his generation would not have done and would not have even understood. Each of these is documented. None of them fit the fairy tale. All of them are the reason the marriage survived. A word about how this channel works. We read the record, the memoirs, the interviews, the public archive, the contemporaneous coverage. In this case, that means Betty Ford's own 2 books, The Times of My Life from 1978 and A Glad Awakening from 1987, her husband's memoir, the oral histories and the newspaper record of 5 decades. We do not invent scenes, and when the record is silent, we say so. The Fords are unusual among the couples this channel studies, because so much of what would normally be buried was eventually said out loud by Betty herself, on camera and to microphones, against every rule of her era. That candor is our primary source. It is also, as you will see, the answer to the question. Begin, then, where she began. Elizabeth Ann Bloomer was born in April of 1918 and raised in Grand Rapids, Michigan, a furniture town, Dutch Reformed, conservative, a place where a woman's reputation was a load-bearing wall. Her father, William Bloomer, was a traveling salesman who sold conveyor belts across the Midwest, gone for long stretches. And when Betty was 16, he died of carbon monoxide fumes while working under the family car in a closed garage. It was at his funeral, she wrote decades later, that she first learned her father had been an alcoholic. Her mother had carried that secret for an entire marriage, so completely that the children never knew, filed that away. The first marriage Betty Bloomer ever observed up close was organized around an absence and a concealment, and she would spend her whole adult life deciding what to do about both. She wanted none of Grand Rapids. She wanted to dance. She studied under a local teacher named Carla Travis, spent 2 transforming summers at the Bennington School of the Dance in Vermont, where she came into the orbit of Martha Graham herself, and then moved to New York, joined Graham's auxiliary troupe, performed at Carnegie Hall, and modeled for the John Robert Powers Agency to pay her rent. Graham told her, in effect, what Graham told nearly everyone, that the first rank demanded a totality Betty was not going to give it, and her mother negotiated a deal, come home for 6 months, and if the pull was still there, go back. She came home. She took a job as fashion coordinator at her Polsheimer's department store downtown, trained the models, staged the shows, and taught dance to children on the side. And in 1942, she married a salesman named William Warren, a charming man who sold insurance and furniture and moved the couple from town to town, and who was, though the word was never used, a heavy drinker. When Warren collapsed into a diabetic coma, Betty spent roughly 2 years nursing a husband she had already privately decided to leave because leaving a sick man was not done, and only when he recovered did she file. The marriage ended in 1947, and Betty Bloomer Warren became something Grand Rapids did not have a polite word for: a divorcee, 29 years old. Starting over, she would later be, in effect, an entry in the kind of federal survey data that catalogs first marriage dissolution, divorce, and remarriage in the United States, one line among millions in the National Center for Health Statistics tables. But in 1947, in western Michigan, it did not feel statistical. It felt like a mark. The man who courted her that same year was, on paper, the worst possible match for a marked woman. Gerald Ford was a lawyer, a former college football star who had played center on Michigan's undefeated national championship teams of 1932 and 33 and turned down professional offers from the Green Bay Packers and the Detroit Lions to attend Yale Law School, a Navy veteran who had nearly been swept off the deck of the carrier Monterey in a Pacific typhoon, and a rising Republican preparing to challenge Bartle Junkman, an entrenched isolationist incumbent in the primary of one of the most conservative districts in the Midwest. His advisors understood the arithmetic immediately. So the courtship was conducted quietly, the engagement was announced late, and the wedding was scheduled for October 15, 1948. 2.5 weeks before Election Day, close enough to the vote that the marriage could not become a campaign issue, far enough from it to be decent. Hold that fact. The timing of Betty Ford's wedding was a political calculation. She knew it. She married him anyway, and on the day itself, the groom arrived at Grace Episcopal Church late, having come straight from campaigning, and he stood at the altar in shoes with dried mud on them, because he had spent that morning at farms in the western part of the district, shaking hands. Even the honeymoon was annexed. The newlyweds attended a University of Michigan football game and a political rally for Thomas Dewey before the week was out. And in November, Gerald Ford was elected to the House of Representatives from Michigan's 5th District with better than 60% of the vote, the first of 13 consecutive victories at that margin. The pattern of the next quarter century was set at the altar. The campaign came first. It always came first. She had seen the mud on his shoes on her own wedding day, and we should be honest about what that means. She was not deceived about the man. She was deceived, as young wives are, about how much of it she could carry. Now watch the mechanism work, because what happened to Betty Ford over the following 25 years was not one dramatic betrayal. It was arithmetic. Gerald Ford was a congressman for a quarter of a century, and from 1965, after he unseated Charles Halleck in an internal party coup, he was House Minority Leader, which meant he was not merely a legislator but a traveling salesman for his entire party, crossing the country to raise money and campaign for other men, because his own ambition, the speakership, could only be reached by electing more Republicans everywhere else. By his family's own count, in some years he was away more than 250 nights. 258 is the number that appears in the record for one of them, which means that in that year the marriage existed in the same room for about 100 evenings. Betty raised 4 children, Michael, Jack, Stephen, and Susan, in a suburban house on Crownview Drive in Alexandria, Virginia, essentially alone, den mother, Sunday school teacher, chauffeur, disciplinarian, while performing in public the role of the contented political wife. And in 1964, the body presented its bill. Reaching across to raise a stuck window, she pinched a nerve in her neck, and the pain became chronic, radiating down her arm. And the answer of that era's medicine was pills. Prescription painkillers prescribed by physicians, taken as directed, layered over time with medication for muscle spasm, for anxiety, and for sleep, until she was carrying what she later described as a purse full of bottles, and layered over all of it, the drink. The 5 o'clock cocktail that was not deviance in 1960s, Washington but etiquette. The second one at 7, the nightcap that helped the pills work. The C.C. notes today that prescription opioids carry a real risk of dependence, even when taken exactly as prescribed. Betty Ford had no such warning. She had refills from multiple doctors who never compared notes, which was not malpractice in that era, but standard practice. By 1970, the loneliness and the pain had compounded to the point that she sought psychiatric help twice a week, which she later spoke about openly. Decades before that was a thing political wives admitted. And the psychiatrist correctly identified the core complaint, which was not madness but erasure, a woman who had subtracted herself, piece by piece, until she felt she had no identity that was not on loan from her husband's career. Nothing about this was hidden from her husband exactly. It was simply absorbed into the household, the way such things were absorbed then, quietly, without a name, on the understanding that naming it would cost him something. That is the mechanism. Not cruelty. Absence, plus pain, plus silence, compounding annually like interest. It is, you will notice, her mother's marriage and her father's garage, one generation on. Every marriage this channel examines has a ledger like this one. What makes the Fords different is not the ledger. It is what happened when the bill came due 3 separate times in front of the entire country. The first test came in September of 1974. Understand the timing, because the timing is everything. Richard Nixon had resigned on August 9th. Gerald Ford, who had never run for any office larger than a Michigan congressional district, was suddenly president, declaring that our long national nightmare was over. And Betty, who had spent years counting the months to his promised retirement in 1977, was suddenly First Lady. On September 8th, Ford pardoned Nixon, and his approval rating collapsed from 71% to around 50% in a matter of days. The single steepest fall gallop had ever measured for a new president. They had been in the White House barely 7 weeks, the administration bleeding from the pardon, when a routine medical examination, one Betty had scheduled almost as an afterthought after accompanying a friend to her own appointment, found a lump in her right breast, and within 48 hours she was in surgery at Bethesda Naval Hospital, and the operation was a mastectomy, the removal of the breast, which the Mayo Clinic describes plainly as a major surgery for breast cancer, and which in 1974 was performed in its most radical form, breast, chest muscle, and lymph nodes together, because the biopsy and the removal happened under a single anesthesia, and a woman went to sleep not knowing what she would wake up without. Here is what the era expected. The era expected the word cancer to be whispered, the word breast never to be said at all, and the First Lady's condition to be described as, at most, a health matter. With her husband's full agreement, the White House announced the diagnosis and the operation in explicit terms, and she allowed herself to be photographed in recovery, tossing a football her family had brought her, and she spoke about self-examination to a country of women who had never heard a public figure say those words. The effect was immediate and measurable. Screening appointments surged so sharply that cancer registries later documented a spike in detected cases in 1974 and 75 that epidemiologists still refer to as the Betty Ford blip, thousands of tumors found earlier than they otherwise would have been. Among the women who examined themselves that autumn, because of her was Happy Rockefeller, wife of the incoming vice president, who found her own cancer within weeks. Women are alive today, statistically and certainly because of that press release. But this is a channel about a marriage, so look at the other figure in the hospital room. Gerald Ford, 7 weeks into an unelected presidency, in the middle of the worst political inheritance of the century, was told the tumor was malignant while working in the Oval Office. And he said later it was the hardest day of his life, harder than assuming the presidency, and by every account from that week he fell apart privately and showed up publicly and kept showing up at the bedside on the phone between meetings, holding the line. There is research published in 2014 in the journal Asian Oncology Nursing, examining women recovering from mastectomy, and it found a relationship between how supported a patient felt by her spouse and how actively she engaged in her own recovery. Betty Ford, in 1974, was living that finding 3 decades before it was measured. She would say in various ways for the rest of her life that his response to the surgery, to a body altered in the precise way that era taught women to fear most, settled something in her about the marriage. The absence of 25 years did not vanish, but a different fact was now on the ledger beside it. Remember the mud on the shoes? This was the counterweight. The second test she created herself, deliberately on national television. On August 10, 1975, Betty Ford sat down with Morley Safer for an interview on 60 Minutes, and over the course of that conversation she did what no First Lady had ever done. Asked hypothetically what she would do if her 18-year-old daughter Susan told her she was having an affair, she declined to perform shock and said she wouldn't be surprised, that Susan was a perfectly normal human being and that she would want to know the young man. She spoke about her children and marijuana with the shrug of an actual parent rather than the script of a political asset, saying they had probably tried it, as she probably would have at their age. She called the Supreme Court's abortion decision in Roe v. Wade a great, great decision. She talked about her own psychiatric care as casually as a dental appointment. Every answer was a small detonation. The mail arrived at the White House in sacks, roughly 33,000 letters by the final count, and in the first weeks it ran heavily against her. And conservative commentators and clergy demanded in so many words that the president control his wife. One newspaper called her a disgrace to the White House. Sit with that phrase, control his wife, because the entire 1970s is inside it. And now the test. Gerald Ford was an unelected president facing a primary challenge from Ronald Reagan and his party's right flank in a nomination fight that would ultimately come down to 100 delegates, and his wife had just handed that flank a weapon. The standard play, the play executed by 100 political husbands before and since, was distance, a clarifying statement, a quiet muzzling. Ford joked when he first heard that he had lost 10 million votes, and then when he saw the coverage that he had lost 20 million, and then he did nothing. No walk back, no correction, no handlers dispatched to the East Wing. And the strange thing, the thing the furious letter writers did not anticipate, is that the country came around. The mail itself turned, ending closer to 2 supportive letters for every critical one. Her approval rating climbed toward 75%, well above her husband's, until campaign buttons appeared in the 76 race, reading Betty's husband for president, and the White House, rather than suppressing them, enjoyed them, and Betty herself campaigned under the CB radio handle First Mama. Here is what that episode actually was underneath the politics. It was a husband declining, in the most public forum on earth, to trade his wife's voice for his own advantage, at the exact moment the trade was cheapest for him and most expensive for her. She had married a man whose career came first, always, since the mud at the altar. In August of 1975, for once, measurably, it did not. The third test came on the evening of November 2nd, 1976, and into the morning after. And it is the one this channel finds most telling, because there were no cameras inside it that mattered until the very end. Gerald Ford lost the presidency to Jimmy Carter by 2 points in the popular vote, 297 electoral votes to 240, a margin so thin that a shift of roughly 11,000 ballots in Ohio and Hawaii would have reversed it after a furious final barnstorm in which he had shredded his voice, giving speech after speech, so that on the morning after the defeat he could barely speak above a rasp. The concession, the ritual reading of the telegram to the victor, the gracious public surrender, he physically could not perform it. So Betty did. She stood in the White House press room on November 3rd, her husband beside her, hoarse and hollowed, their children flanking them, and she read his concession telegram to Jimmy Carter for him, congratulating the man who had just defeated her husband in a steady voice to the nation. Think about the geometry of that moment. For 28 years, the marriage had run one direction, his name on the ballot, her life in the margins, her wedding scheduled around his election. And at the exact hour of his greatest professional loss, the partnership inverted, and she became literally his voice. If the story ended there, it would be a fine, sad, symmetrical ending. Because they retired to Rancho Mirage, into a house being built off the 13th fairway of a golf course, and the structure that had organized Betty Ford's entire adult life, the campaigns, the role, the schedule, the performance, was suddenly gone, and what remained was a woman in her late 50s with chronic pain from the neck, and now an arthritic condition on top of it, a long-standing prescription regimen, a habit of drinking that no longer had a social calendar to hide inside, and time. Gerald, meanwhile, filled his own void, the way such men do, with boards and speeches and travel, gone again, absent in retirement, as he had been absent in office. The 18 months after the White House were the descent. The family watched her recede, slurring through a television interview, falling, cracking ribs, moving through her own kitchen in slow motion, sedated, diminishing, and this is the point in the story where, in almost every comparable household of that generation, nothing happens. The wife fades, the husband golfs, the children call less. The obituary, years later, says she had been in declining health. Which brings us back to the living room on April 1st, 1978, and the promise made at the top of this episode, the thing Gerald Ford did that most husbands of his generation would not have done. He was in the room. That sounds small. It is not small. The push had come from Susan, 20 years old, frightened by what she was watching, who had consulted a Rancho Mirage physician named Joseph Cruz, himself a recovering alcoholic, and a first smaller attempt at confrontation had already failed, with Betty ordering the participants out of her house, so the family escalated. The intervention, a structured confrontation guided by a physician, in this case Captain Joseph Persh, the Navy psychiatrist who ran the alcohol rehabilitation service at Long Beach, was at that time a new and radical practice, barely a decade old as a formal technique, and it required each family member to sit in front of Betty and read specific, dated, factual accounts of what her drinking and her medications had done, not accusations but evidence, delivered with love. The children were there, flown in quietly so she would suspect nothing. Michael and his wife Gail spoke about their fear of bringing children into her orbit. Stephen described cooking her a dinner she was too sedated to eat. Susan told her mother, the former Martha Graham dancer, that she had watched her fall and that the falling was what broke her. And Gerald Ford, former President of the United States, 64 years old, raised in the emotional deep freeze of the Midwestern 1920s, sat in that circle and took his turn. He told her what he had watched. He did not delegate it to the doctor or soften it into nothing. And when she agreed to treatment at the Long Beach Naval Hospital, he did the second thing his generation of men did not do. He canceled paid engagements and he participated, sitting in family therapy sessions, absorbing in front of strangers, an accounting of his own decades of absence, because the treatment model held correctly that her illness had grown in the climate of the whole family, and he accepted his share of the weather. At Long Beach, Betty declined the private accommodations her status could have commanded and stayed in a shared four-bedroom with other women, enlisted men's wives among them, because the treatment held that isolation was the disease's best friend. And then Betty Ford did the thing that made her immortal. Handed the era's standard cover story, Fatigue, a Reaction to Medication. And having initially signed a statement admitting only the pills, she sat with the dishonesty for about a week and found she could not carry it. On April 21st, she released a second statement in her own name, saying that she was addicted not only to medication but to alcohol. A former First Lady of the United States used the word. 1978. No public figure of her rank had ever done it. And here is the detail that almost no telling of this story includes, the one that reframes all of it. Betty Ford's candor was not a personality quirk. It was a survival strategy she had learned 30 years earlier, and she had learned it from the marriage itself, and before that from her mother's kitchen, where her father's alcoholism was concealed so well his own daughter learned of it at his funeral. Remember 1948. She entered this union as the thing that could not be said, a divorced dancer hidden until 2 weeks before the election, a woman whose very existence was managed as a liability. She had lived, at the start of the marriage, inside a concealment, and she had felt what concealment costs, and she had watched, in childhood, what a lifetime of it had cost her mother. Every famous act of openness that followed, the mastectomy announcement, the 60 Minutes interview, the addiction statement, was the same single decision made over and over. She would not be the secret again. Not even her own secret. And the marriage survived because Gerald Ford, whatever his absences, ratified that decision every single time it would have been cheaper not to. He co-signed the cancer announcement 7 weeks into a wounded presidency. He refused to muzzle her when his own nomination hung on the votes she was allegedly costing him. He sat in the intervention circle and then in the therapy sessions, letting his own failures be entered into the record. That is the answer to the episode's question, and notice that it is not romantic. It is structural. The marriage held because concealment, the solvent that dissolves these unions from the inside, was taken off the table by her insistence and his consent. What the two of them built on that foundation, in what should have been retirement, outlasts them both. In 1982, 4 years sober, Betty Ford co-founded, with her neighbor Leonard Firestone, a former ambassador and a fellow recovering alcoholic, a treatment center on the campus of the Eisenhower Medical Center in Rancho Mirage that carried her name, and understand that she initially resisted putting her name on it and was persuaded by the logic that the name was the therapy, an addiction hospital branded with a First Lady's identity, so that walking through its doors carried her permission instead of a stigma. She did not lend the name and leave. She chaired the board for more than 2 decades, insisted that half the beds be reserved for women whose addiction the field had barely bothered to study, and greeted incoming patients herself with the words that became the institution's liturgy, telling roomfuls of strangers that she was Betty and she was an alcoholic. Gerald raised money for it and sat in its orbit for the rest of his life, and the center drew serious addiction medicine into its circle. Physicians like Mark Gold, who served on the board of the Betty Ford Center's foundation. And the premise the center ran on, that addiction is an illness with pathways into it and pathways out, is now simply how the field thinks. There is an entire modern research literature, including a 2021 scholarly volume on dynamic pathways to recovery from alcohol use disorder, devoted to studying how people get well, a question that could barely be asked in public before a president's wife asked it about herself. None of this is medical advice, and this channel is not a doctor. If the middle of this story sounded familiar in your own house, the pills that became a decade, the drinking that lost its calendar, that is a conversation for a physician, and the whole point of Betty Ford's life is that having it early is not shameful. It is the move. They were married for 58 years. Gerald Ford died on December 26, 2006, at 93. At that point, the longest-lived president in American history, and for the funeral rites, Betty, frail at 88, traveled with the casket through every ceremony, Washington, the Capitol Rotunda, Grand Rapids, upright the entire way, 6 days of it. She lived 4.5 more years and died in July of 2011, also 93, and among the eulogists she chose for her own funeral was Rosalind Carter, wife of the man whose victory Betty had once announced in her husband's failed voice. Because the two women had become genuine allies in the cause of mental health, and Betty wanted that partnership born out of a concession speech spoken over her casket. They are buried beside each other on the grounds of his museum in Grand Rapids, a few miles from the church where he arrived late with mud on his shoes. We built a fairy tale around them, of course. We always do. The accidental president and his brave, outspoken wife, wholesome as a Michigan autumn. And the fairy tale, for once, is not exactly a lie. It is just incomplete, the way a portrait is incomplete, because it leaves out the 25 years of absence, the 258 nights, the purse full of bottles, the sacks of furious mail, the living room on April 1st. The marriage we admired was not the marriage that never broke. It was the marriage that kept choosing, at every fracture, to say the unsayable thing out loud and remain. That is a harder story than the one we were sold. It is also, for once, a better one. If this kind of history is what you came for, the real account underneath the official portrait, subscribe to Behind the Portrait and tap the like button so the next episode finds you. There are more marriages in the archive, and very few of them were what they appeared. I will see you at the next portrait.